Tēnā koutou, koutou, good afternoon, and thank you very much, Katie, for bringing this event here today. A very warm welcome to Te Whare Wānaka, Aoraki, Lincoln University, and the Excellence Series. My name is Grant Edwards, and I'm very proud to have this series here at the university, and it's something that is very special to me as Vice-Chancellor to bring these initiatives to the fore. This Excellence Series celebrates the outstanding scholarship from real-world research that is shaping a more sustainable and resilient future for Aotearoa New Zealand. It brings together leading thinkers and practitioners whose work is influencing policy, practice, and public debate both nationally and internationally. Today's event focuses on environmental governance and the future of resource management in New Zealand. I think there are a few pieces of legislation that have shaped our landscapes, communities and economy as profoundly as the Resource Management Act. Introduced as a world-leading planning legislation, the RMA set out to balance environmental protection and development. Yet over time, it has become one of the most debated and contested frameworks in this country. We're delighted tonight to welcome Associate Professor Hamish Rennie, who will share his reflections on the life, legacy and the future of the RMA. After more than 3 decades working at the intersection of research and practice, Hamish brings a rare depth of insight into how environmental planning operates in the real world. Hamish's research spans geography, environmental planning and management of shared resources, from oceans and freshwater to biodiversity. He has worked with the United Nations, agencies, regional councils, iwi and community organisations contributing to coastal policy and law, tourism resilience, water and riparian management, and the protection of cherished places that I think are dear to his heart, such as Te Whare Lake Ellesmere. This promises to be a timely and thought-provoking conversation about the future of environmental governance in Aotearoa New Zealand. Please join me in welcoming Hamish Rennie.
Tēnā koutou katoa. I'd just like to first start by acknowledging this sculpture by David Lloyd, a local sculptor who spent some time around Te Whare Lake Ellesmere and whose sculpture, the nature and balance, is the inspiration for the title of this particular presentation today. I think it highlights the actual fact that we are balancing a bit of a tightrope in how we manage the environment, manage each other, manage our relationships with the environment. And I think it's the theme of this talk is that we have lost some of that balance in how we do things. So, hopefully this works, yeah. What I want to do in terms of looking back at over the last 30 plus years of the Resource Management Act is to do it through some windows of some of the research I've done over that time and some of the insights it's given to the drawing out stuff from that. So I've grouped this into 3 particular categories for this particular presentation. They're listed up there: empowering and enabling, freshwater management and ideology overall. And I'm going to touch on each of those as I go through this talk. But first I thought I'd just make it clear what we mean by planning, because I know that not all of you are planners. How many planners in the room? Few, not many. Okay, thank you, planners. So basically, planning is about setting goals and setting the means and process of getting there. And now, particularly here, it's about land use and environmental planning, looking at the goals for the future for the environment we live in and how people relate to that environment. And we're both statutory and non-statutory planning. Non-statutory being things like the Greater Christchurch Urban Growth Strategy, and statutory being the Resource Management Act. I'm just going to focus on the Resource Management Act because that's the one that has teeth. It's the one that actually really gets enforced in law and basically impacts on all of us. I think it's worth reminding people that planning was developed as an efficient way to resolve conflict between people, as opposed to having to go to court and fight out cases of nuisance and trespass and things like that. planning brings efficiency because it solves a whole lot of those issues without going to the courts. I know that seems almost anathema to people who think of planning as all about going to the courts, but that's what it is actually more efficient. In doing so, it does interfere with individual rights in order to protect community rights or the Commonwealth of rights. And that is actually neolibertarian thinking. If you go back to John Locke, you'll see they said that one of the bases you can interfere with individual rights is if you're working for the Commonwealth of rights, the overall people's rights, as a basis on which you can interfere with individual rights. And that's encapsulated in the planning system. We're working for the public good, or the public interest, as planners refer to it. The thing that often people don't think about is the value add that planning brings. People seem to think of planning as getting in the way. It actually adds value to what we do because it provides us with legitimate expectations. It takes this messy, confused world and says, over the next 10 years, this is roughly how we're going to do things. This is where we're going. These are things that are allowed and not allowed. And then you can invest on that basis. So it provides a basis for legitimate expectations of what's going to happen and how it's going to happen, the processes through which it's going to happen. And the Resource Management Act is really the holy grail of planning. Every time I go overseas and talk about the Resource Management Act, people say, wow, I wish we had that here. And then they all tell me about the systems that they have there, which resemble the Town and Country Planning Act, which we used to have, or I better not talk about the future because I never like to talk about future legislation until it's actually in place. So what traditionally happens in planning is that planning is based on activities. They say this thing is good there, this thing is good there, that thing is good there. And so this area is for commercial, this is for residential, this is for industrial, this is for recreation, that sort of thing. And then everyone's stuck in that straitjacket. If you want to have a hairdressers in a residential area, you can't because it's commercial activity. So you end up somewhere else. Whereas in actual fact, the adverse effect you would have on the community or the environment of having a hairdressers there is probably zilch compared to your next door neighbour who's just happens to be trimming their neighbour's hair. You're just getting paid for it. So the RMA basically said, we're not concerned about where activities are, we're concerned about the adverse effects you have on other people's rights, the community's rights, other people's rights. Rather than going to the courts to solve that, we want to solve that through the planning system. You tell us what are the things that you do not want to happen, what are the adverse effects you do not want to have, and you tell us as a community what are the communal adverse effects you do not want, you don't see it acceptable for the majority of people, for the public good. And we will put that into plans in the form of rules. And these rules say that you cannot do certain things that have these, that you cannot have these adverse effects. Not what you can do, but you cannot have these adverse effects. And then it's up to you as the individual to figure out how to avoid having those adverse effects while you do what you want to do. So you can use your land any way you want, provided you don't have those adverse effects. And some of the things we're concerned about is future generations. We want future generations to have the same opportunities we have. So we want to ensure that resources are sustained for that. We care about nature and the environment, at least the Resource Management Act said that we did. And so it said that we give nature some rights in this particular process. It came out of the renaissance of tangata whenua and the culture that was coming back to the fore out of the 1970s, 1980s, and recognition of Maori rights and Maori relatedness to the environment. And so it put a lot of emphasis on Maori values and the treaty and those sort of issues. And it also recognised that we just had a major neoliberal revolution in the 1980s. And so we were trying to get the market decide, we were trying to base things on rights. And so it said basically, all we're concerned about is your rights and that you not affect other people's rights. So you do what you want as long as you don't affect other people's rights to clean air, clean water, etc. So to give you an example, once upon a time, the answer to pollution was dilution. It seemed you send your waste down the river, and the people down the river, if they want to use the water, would have to clean the waste up. And people said, hey, this is a hidden subsidy to these people up here are discharging. They're being subsidised by the people downstream who are having to clean that muck out of their particular river. So what we turned around and said, actually, we think polluters should pay. We think people should internalise their externalities so that they actually have to deal with their waste themselves. So how about we do that in legislation? Oh yeah, Resource Management Act. We've done it. So it took a whole change in attitude, saying that we want to clean things up. And as a result, there's a lot of support from the environmentalists, as well as the neoliberals who didn't want hidden subsidies, and also from tangata whenua. And it just happened to come along at a time when we had some really capable ministers in Sir Geoffrey Palmer, and subsequently Simon Upton and Dennis Marshall also put in that bracket. So we had some really good ministers at the time, and we actually had about this time in 1990, just saying before, this time in 1990, we're in almost an identical situation to what we are in now, where the resource management bill introduced to Parliament, it was going through debate, it's going to be passed before the election, and it didn't get through, and so government changed, everyone said, oh, what's going to happen? National came in, having criticised it, then they had a look at it, and they said, actually, it's not too bad, we quite like a lot of this, so they had bipartisan support when it got passed in 1991. And that's the key to it lasting for so long, I think, that had that bipartisan support right at the outset. Okay, it achieved a balance of all those disparate goals and groups in society. If it's so good, why do we want to throw it out now? Well, lots of people say they want to throw it out. This is from 2020, when the end of it's nigh. 2026 now, isn't it? Nigh seems to have stretched. And it's looked at the other items on the RNZ page that they read more, all these different things. I love the bit David Parker's taking on the RMA, Hydra. Oh, wicked fearsome thing, the Hydra. And it's all going too slow. David Parker said, in response to a question at the New Zealand Planetary Conference in Christchurch a couple of years later, when they was putting through the legislation, he was asked what was really wrong with the Resource Management Act that couldn't be fixed with a few minor amendments. He said, well, actually, I don't think there is anything significantly wrong with it. I think it could be fixed. It's become politically unacceptable. It's lost its political legitimacy. Therefore, it has to change. So here's a guy, a minister, saying, actually, there's nothing really wrong with it, but it's lost its political legitimacy. So, some critical matters that occurred over this period that I think helped to put things in context. We had right from the outset 20 years of misinterpretation of the purpose of the Act after a court case decision over ferries, of all things, the ferry terminal in the Marlborough Sounds, which was followed up by a decision by the one judge who had been sort of taking a different line, the one judge who had come from the Ministry of Justice and knew what the Act was supposed to be all about, fell over in a court case on marine farming and yellow slimy, which was going to cure cancer. And so, because of the benefits of health, the TRIO decision and the NZ Rail decision end up giving us a misinterpretation of the Resource Management Act, which was the overall broad judgment, which meant that you could basically weigh things up and throw them around however you wanted and come up with your overall broad judgment of what was the right thing and what was the wrong thing, instead of having an environmental bottom line, which Simon Upton talked about all the time, putting legislation through. That wasn't changed until 2014, the King Salmon decision, which said actually there's an environmental bottom line here. The case finally got to the Supreme Court and they resolved it. So for 20 years we had a misinterpretation of the purpose of the Act. So a whole lot of stuff went wrong in that 20 years. That's one of the first key critical failures of our time with Resource Management Act. We also had from 2002, 20 years of not considering the effects of greenhouse gas emissions on climate change, because the Labour government passed legislation to rule it out of consideration and instead favoured the emissions trading scheme. We all know how wonderfully well the emissions trading scheme went, don't we? Okay, so 20 years later, after a whole lot of lobbying, and I was involved in some of that with some work I did for the Wise Response, there was basically a write-in and a change, and greenhouse gas emissions could be considered again in the Resource Management Act, or the effects of greenhouse gas emissions on climate change could be. We also, because we came out of a neoliberal period, at the outset, local government said, don't tell us what to do. We don't need central government telling us what to do. We know what to do. We're the local people. Let local people make the local decisions locally. Sound familiar? I heard that a couple of years ago. So as a response, the central government said, okay, light-handed regulation, we won't tell you what to do. We won't put in place any sort of major national policy statements telling you what to do, except for the New Zealand coastal policy, which by law has to be made because the coastal marine area was public commons and the government was sort of in charge of it. We won't put any policy in place. Fortunately, eventually, John Key's national government came in and put in some policies. I'm mentioning these parties because I'm not opposed to any particular party. They've both done things wrong and undermining it. They've both done things right as well. And then for 15 years, we've had heavier legislation. The New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement 2010 is much heavier than the 1994 version. Tells you this is what you shall do, this is what you not do. These are the things you shall avoid. Where the freshwater policy statement came out, national policy statement, where national environmental standards coming out. Unfortunately, the freshwater policy statements and national environmental standards kept on changing for freshwater, so we never got time to see what they were going to do before the next one came out. It takes time for things to go from national policy statement into council plans, into action on the ground. And that's if people actually do anything about them. I'll come to that in a moment. Regional plans, apart from the coastal plans, were voluntary. Some councils took them up, but some councils didn't do water planning. They didn't make it a priority because it wasn't an issue. And so everyone jumped in before the plans were in place to tell them what to do, as happened in Canterbury. And we end up with a lot of the problems we have in Canterbury because we did not have water plans in place. In the 35 years of Resource Management, there's been very limited use of the board inquiry process for making national policies. It's now more or less been removed from the Resource Management Act. As a result, policies tend to be made by, MFE officials and MPI officials, people based in Wellington, and they weren't fully tested on the ground amongst farmers, amongst communities around the country before they were put in place. And then, of course, it would say, this doesn't work for our particular area, for our soil types, for our location. And so they'd have a big uproar, go back, there'd be a groundswell of opposition, and suddenly it would be changed again. I think the Board of Inquiry process, which was used for the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement, has proven its value. But it takes too long. You've got to be quick, fast, rapid. Also, underlying all this, I think there's been too great an expectation placed on science. I really feel sorry for scientists. You've mucked up terribly. We've listened to you and we've got it all wrong. But then, why did we expect so much from you in the first place? Just asking too much. And I'll come back to that shortly. And there's a lack of political fortitude. Some people call it political will. The commitment to implement. Canterbury Regional Council passed a nationally leading form of coastal plan, the Regional Coastal Environment Plan, in 2005. As noted in an article written by Steve Earls and myself not too long ago, despite a requirement that that plan be reviewed and updated to give effect to the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement in 2010 as soon as practicable, is now 2026. And we're still working on the 2005 Coastal Environment Plan. For part of that time, we had commissioners appointed by ministers direct from central government, reporting direct to central government. So it's not locals of the problem, because that was central government. There was no political will to actually implement the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement in the Regional Coastal Environment Plan. And Canterbury isn't the only place that has been tardy in getting its coastal plan updated to implement the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement. So there's a lack of political fortitude in actually doing things and commitment to do things. There's also a lack of fortitude in forcing compliance. But particularly, we are the champions for the Resource Management Act. Since Simon Upton and Dennis Marshall, there have been very few politicians going out and saying, the Resource Management Act is world leading. We should be really singing its praises. They'll go, oh gee, it's created pressure on housing, or there's urban sprawl, or whatever. Where are the champions in the policy world for the Resource Management Act? Remember, it was a bipartisan introduction. Also, just want to highlight that a lot of the issues come from very minor, the impacts have been fairly minor. Less than 4% of applications are notified. Less than 0.5% of applications are actually declined. So just about every application is approved. Why? Because you have to do an environmental assessment of what the effects are going to be. They then invest in the means of dealing with that. And they then get their resource consent. So where dairy farmers used to be able to slough their waste off their dairy pads into near streams and flow down to Waikato River, suddenly there's a whole new industry of how to deal with that waste. And dairy farmers are sort of amongst the major leaders in how to deal with their waste. They invested in the technology, they internalised externalities, they got rid of the hidden subsidies. Just as the RMA wanted them to do. Okay. Agriculture. I did my PhD on agriculture, so these are actually from my PhD, which is why there's such bad images. Someone's still going to be a PhD. This is marine farming rights. Under the old, we'll tell you where to do things. They sort of cite them all around the edge of these areas, and up in the Marlborough Sounds, all those little black lines around the edge, those little ribbons, they were cited there. Now, there are reasons they're cited on one side of the sound and not the other side, so that you take your boat down the other side and have normal, pristine sounds, and the marine farms will be over this side. Those areas are allocated to the agricultural management areas effectively. And what the Resource Management Act said was, if you invest in the adverse effects, dealing with the adverse effects, then you can have your marine farm where you want. So all these smart marine farmers invested in the technology and started to apply for other places. You know, out here, way offshore, and now they're way up in the middle of the straits here, the latest ones, and further north from the tips of the Marlborough Sounds there. There was a race for space that eventuated. We had thought of that in advance. We had coastal tendering all planned. But for some strange reason, when we went to tender space in the Marlborough Sounds to make money, don't kid got this no idea would make money out of tendering space for marine farms. Unfortunately, we had made a fundamental mistake. We hadn't thought to see if we actually owned the rights to the seabed. I'd like to think that my work on creating the coastal tendering system in the Resource Management Act makes me the father of the Te Pati Māori. Okay, another area I've had long involvement with surfing, and I think this really highlights the value of the Resource Management Act. Surfing was not creating an artificial surf break was not something that was ever thought of. And if we'd gone by the old planning system, we would have had real trouble creating an artificial surf break. Under the Resource Management Act, we just had to show that we could deal with that adverse effects. So we did that. We got an artificial surf break being built. This is offshore from Mount Wanganui, Tay Street. It actually had surfable waves at one stage. There were one or two hiccups though. Sometimes you can't actually implement what you design. Things don't necessarily work out quite how. A sausage is supposed to look like a sausage, not like a pear. Okay. Anyway, from that humble beginnings of designing a surf break and again the resource consent for it, which incidentally ended up with a lawyer for the side who opposed us, accusing me of fraud and forgery and some of the other researchers as well. Really stressful. Going through a resource consent application, if you're applying for something, can be incredibly stressful. And you start to wonder if you're going to lose your house over it. We didn't commit fraud and forgery, and so nothing ever happened, but it was stressful for a period. Coming from that, we looked at what about natural surf breaks? How do we protect natural character and natural surf breaks from being damaged by various uses, like, I don't know, dredging going through a sandbar, or upstream of a sandbar, or someone using dynamite, or someone putting a road in a new place after an earthquake, building back better for a cycleway. Great stuff for the cycleway, except the waves refract off that new bit of land that's pushed out towards the sea, affecting the national level of surf break and upsetting this national level of surf break. How do you protect them? So, some of the work I did with a bunch of other people, I have to mention late Robert McGill on this, who was also my PhD student, but became New Zealand's one of New Zealand's leading barristers in the marine area. we made submissions to the New Zealand Coastal Policy Board of Inquiry in 2008, recommended that they protect surf breaks. This actually comes almost directly from my evidence, and that's why there's a problem with it. Claim Schedule 1, people make mistakes, even me, I think I have to own my own mistakes. The problem with this is the spit. Now everyone knows the spit, right? It was called the RMA spit. Fortunately, the surf break that's called the spit is not an Otago. And I didn't actually put it there. I actually put the surf break, the spit, I actually put it here. No, here, right here, just below Kaikoura. So then, I meant to put it above it. I actually accidentally put it below it. It's actually near White Rock, which has featured in the media recently. White Rock isn't a nationally significant surf break, but the spit right next to the White Rock spit is. And unfortunately, me putting it in the wrong place in my evidence led someone to decide to put it down Otago when they printed the final document, and it's still there. Keep on meaning to do something about it. It's only 16 years, so I guess I'm right up there with you guys, Canberra Regional Council. Sorry. We did manage to protect Maungamu from the Build Back Better because it was in there, and I got to write this nice article on the seduction of the fast track recovery legislation as a result of that work. Empowering and enabling, another aspect of it. One of the pieces of work that I did with Jill Thompson, who's a lecturer in the Faculty of Agriculture and Commerce here, back around 1998, funded by MFE, thank you MFE, was look at Section 33. Section 33 enables the transfer of powers, functions and duties to public authorities, including iwi authorities. Everyone's saying, great, it's going really well. We've heard about all these transfers taking place. They had to report to the ministry every time a transfer was being process was begun. They didn't have to report to the ministry about the outcome of the process. So everyone thought there were these transfers going through. But then when you tried to find them, no one could say, oh, where it is. Oh, we think it's up north somewhere or over there somewhere. So we went to look and we found that there were no transfers to iwi. A number had been started, a number had been requested, but they weren't actually happening. So we went and decided to look and see, why is this not happening? And after a lot of interviews and so on around the country, we found there are a couple of issues. A lot of the iwi were focused on their treaty settlements and didn't have a lot of resources available at the time. But there's also a lack of trust. People didn't trust iwi authorities. Why not? I don't know. Perhaps it's racism. And some people actually said, actually, we can't consider transferring anything to iwi, although we think we trust them absolutely, because our community is so racist they will not accept it. So it's in our checklist. Is your community racist? Literally, it's in the checklist for us, which we provided in our work and our guidance. There's only been one transfer. I monitor this all the time. I do an update for the Westport Environmental Handbook on it. So it's now become a 30-year project. I monitor all the other transfers as well. There's been transfers between various levels of government and local and regional councils. Only one transfer to an iwi authority. Water monitoring to Te Whare Wānaka, the Taupo catchment. And that was only a few years ago. Seems to be working. And I full credit to Te Whare Wānaka for getting that, but it's actually a pretty minor transfer, but they got it. So good on them. By the way, I don't think iwi authorities are included in the new version, Section 33 transfer of the new Act. If you look closely, I think it's one thing that's been omitted. Okay, freshwater management. I just want to move to this fairly quickly. I was contracted along with Jill Thompson and some associates of ours to look into co-management arrangements for the Ministry of Fisheries. They want to work out which community organisations they could co-manage with. So we developed a framework based on Ostrom and all those other sorts of gurus on co-management systems and things like that. And we did an analysis of a whole lot of case studies around the country. And we said, you can't look at the quota holder associations that don't fit the criteria. They said, can you look at others? We said, yeah. So we looked at this outfit called the Waihore Ellesmere Trust, because we knew there was already a co-management arrangement between DOC and my tahu or Te Whare Lake Ellesmere, and I grew up on the shores of Lake Ellesmere. My connection to Te Whare goes back several generations, back to the 1860s, 1890s, around Lake Ellesmere. So I was personally interested. The Waihoa Ellesmere Trust met just about every criteria. So when I moved down here in 2007, I ended up on the trust because I wanted to know how it worked inside. I thought this was actually working. I want to be part of it. And the very first thing I had to do was talk to the 2007 symposium about the Living Lake Symposium, which is called the Living Lake Symposium because of this particular decision of the Linton Dairy versus Canberra Regional Council. And the court, I've just picked out one. This isn't the worst statement the court makes about what was happening there. It says, for current purposes, there's no doubt that there's significant degradation of the lake and waterways in the lowland area in terms of water quality and the mobility of the waterways in the area. Great Stead Māori being considered. These are my waterways. This is the Selwyn River. This is Boggy Creek. Hammer Drain. These are areas I grew up with. And they're saying this is all in a pretty bad state. And they're right. So we held a symposium here in 2007, doing biennially ever since then with a couple of breaks for COVID. 2027, put in your diary now, Living Lake Symposium 2027, looking back 20 years and how far we've come, or not. Anyway, out of that came some research on riparian restoration. And also, I thought I want to touch on this as well. From the whole of the work on freshwater management in this particular catchment, one of the novel things that came out was the concept of farm environment plans. This is micro planning. Okay, gone from regional councils, national level, regional councils, district plans down to micro planning. And my particular farm, we are in a cultural landscape area. We have to get a resource consent to farm, and as a condition on that, we have to have a farm environment plan saying how we're going to look after the environment. That led us on when I was working this resilience challenge to think about how do you create a resilient farm planning module onto that as well. That's a whole nother story. What I've concluded, I just want to highlight one thing here. This zone here is an inanga spawning habitat zone. This is a stop bank down here that is 3 meters high. You'll see that the inanga somehow managed to climb over the stop bank and go and hide out in the barn here to get to spawn. This is the sort of thing that gets science into trouble. Especially as the rules for the inanga spawning habitat have significant effects on the farmers in terms of what they can and cannot do. Can't graze any sheep or anything there. Can't drive a tractor. All sorts of things. Now it's partially fixed. But one thing we learned from the Linton dairies was that you can have scientists there, but they disagree. Scientists are human. They're not value free, neutral, etc. And so the judge has to choose which scientists they're going to listen to or they're going to accept. Here we see scientists working with planners making a mistake in how they actually depict something with major consequences. The reality of science is that often they're trying to provide a simple measure to communicate things which doesn't actually show the complexity underneath it. So you can work a lot on riparian planting to clean up certain things from going to the stream. All the farmers work really hard on that. They actually improve the particular value, but the overall trophic level goes down. So demoralising. You know? Places said not swimmable, but actually they are swimmable most of the time. It's just that there's a risk that they might not be swimmable after a particular storm event. So they are labelled red, coast forward. If you look behind the data, you'll see it's actually safe to swim most of the time. There's a red sign on it on the Lawa website. There's a lot of informative discourse on there. There's lag effects in terms of the time it takes to get plans made and on the ground. Also in terms of the time it takes for the effects of pollution in the upper levels of a catchment to get to the lower levels through the groundwater. These all mean you have to have patience to see if plans work or not. There's a performative discourse. If I'm going to invest in an irrigation scheme, with multi-million-dollar irrigation scheme, I don't think I would do it 5 years before my resource consent was going to expire. I would think that was foolish. However, in Otago Regional Council hearings, that's called, if you don't give it to us, give us the resource consent we need, you have stranded our assets. Stranded your assets? That's a foolish investment. But it works. Who's a community and all that sort of stuff. One of the problems with farm environment plans is it tends to objectify the land as science, and I think you lose your sense of connection, relationship. I felt really broken with my relationship with the Selwyn River after doing a farm environment plan on it. Just felt alien somehow. I won't go through all this since I've already covered it. Coastal tendering, landowners' rights, cultural landscapes, all these things are things that impact on you, but the plans are made for the common good. If you get something out of kilter, like you create a urban development national policy statement which says you can go ahead and do urban development, even if the plans say you don't, over all this farmland, and don't have in place highly productive land policy to protect that high quality farmland, then what's going to happen? You have urban sprawl. Look at Selwyn. Right. So we've had learned quite a bit about the nature of property rights in this process. Finally, I just want to touch on the ideological. And this actually came through to me as, I worked quite a bit with Tangata Whenua, the RMA case, so the Otaiti, the person that is Otaiti Reef or Australian Reef if you're not local. Surfers and divers, research on them shows they have a spiritual connection to the environment. I had a student, Walter Loothwaite, do his PhD, some of you will know from other categories, do his PhD overseas looking at aid and the development of aid by secular NZ aid delivery people, trying not to proselytise religion to various people who are strongly religious. And the thing that came through from that research was they didn't care what religion the aid people had, but they really cared that they were secular. Because if you don't have a God, how can we trust you? Where's your moral base? I think it's really, it really struck me. I never thought, I used to work in foreign affairs and the development, and we made sure we didn't appoint anyone who wasn't secular to anything. So I think what that brings through to me is that, and one of my major sort of revelation to me over these years has been that Tangata Whenua and their relationship with place, that relatedness to place, comes through kaitiakitanga and looking after the Māori of an area. That spirituality and connection is really important, and because Tangata Whenua identify in that way, then they are ultimately going to be the really good guardians for that spot. We need to really push the concept of stewardship to match that. And, for non-Tangata Whenua, getting that same sort of relationship to place, that land ethic really built in. Okay? I'm sure I can leave it up to MFE to tell us if that's actually in the new legislation or not. Okay, so knowledge, commitment to implement the law, patience to allow plans to have effect, trust in each other and in the RMA. Those are where we've failed the Resource Management Act. There's a whole lot of successes. I just want to highlight one top. Everyone has to do an assessment of their effects to know if they need a resource consent or not. And the empowerment of Tangata Whenua at the bottom. A whole lot of stuff in between, some of which may or may not be good or bad or true. The last thing I want to cover here is what is needed in future legislation. I think we've learned we need a clear purpose. I'm sure you can tell us if there's a clear purpose or not. We need rights for nature. It's not just a resource. Who would suggest that in legislation? The ecosystem-based approach actually works in freeing us up, empowering us to innovate, to do things differently, through internalising the externalities. We need a knowledge-informed and generating processes. So we need the resource. We need information brought forward and acquired. We need political stability and a bipartisan commitment to actually make things last for a while. And we need the great empowerment of Tangata Whenua. Not sure that's happening in the proposed legislation. And as I said, the promotion of stewardship and the relatedness for non-Tangata Whenua. Okay, those are just a few of the many things I would like to see in future legislation based on what I've seen over the last few years. That's it for me. The key thing here is don't panic. We have AI here to save us and resources of biblical abundance, or so I'm told. So all will be well. I thank you for being with me. I'm sorry I'm over time.
Opportunity now for some questions or comments to Hamish. Yeah. Rennie, please.
I'm prepared to ask one of my colleagues. Hamish, you know that last slide that you had up for the sheeps here?
Oh, that thing, oops, I got on way.
That really looked like the RMA. And look, I want to put a proposition to you. The architect of the RMA, Sir Geoffrey Palmer, at New Zealand Planning Institute conference a few years back, said that the failure of the RMA was not so much the RMA itself, but the failure of implementation. So the thing is, you reference Section 33 transfers, only done in 30 years. A slew of national policy statements that have only come out in the last few years. That's more an implementation issue rather than substance. So that's putting that there. Or are you arguing for a back to the future return to the Town and Country Planning Act 1977, which is what the Winston Peters was doing about a couple of years ago, I think. Anyway, just throwing it out there.
Yeah, definitely the former.
Right.
Not the latter. Yeah, no, definitely the former. I have to remember the Town and Country Planning Act, towards the end of its days, 1977, there were a number of amendments to it, which, for instance, the recognition of the cultural relations of tangata whenua came in 1977, ended Town Country Planning Act, and was carried through to the Resource Management Act. So there were some changes there I think were really good. I think the Resource Management Act improved on that, and had other improvements. Mana whakahona Aotearoa, the put in by the previous Māori Party, was a major step forward too. So yeah, I definitely think everyone else in the world is looking for the RMA, and we're busy throwing it out. Mind you, I think MFE is slightly trying to keep various bits of the RMA in the new legislation, but I wouldn't dare say that in case someone figures it out.
Okay, Fizz Ron.
How do we get the bipartisan commitment that you've got up there and talked about through the?
I have no idea. We seem to have become quite polarised, and so this claim or that, and it's almost like watching America. Everything they did is right, so we'll throw it all out and do. I just need some common sense, so make sure sit down and talk with each other instead of talking to what I do to LinkedIn and Facebook echo chambers. Don't do that. Talk to each other. It's just, it beggars my mind. That is a good research project. Please, want to fund it?
There's the bat, Nathan.
Thank you for the talk. You talk about the RMA being easily politicised, and that's part of the reason why it might be shoved out. I would say there's an argument to be made that part of the issue there is in communication, how easy it is for the layperson to understand. So how do we make future legislation easy to understand for non-planners so that it's not as easily politicised?
Thank you. It's a really good point. It's one I had in my slides originally, but I cut it out. I was trying to cut it down. Didn't quite make it all the way down. One of the problems with effects-based planning is really hard to communicate. People are used to thinking in terms of activities, and they want to know that they can do this here, this activity here, this activity there. It's much easier to understand than trying to work out what are the effects of my particular activity. So it's really hard to communicate that change. I think that's been one of the major problems that has caused some of the political problems with it. I don't have an easy solution to that either, because after 35 years, we haven't figured that one out. Yeah, it's just one of those other really hard things. The problem that you get though then is, and I demonstrated this to from being a commissioner on agriculture management area here in Northland, and subsequently to a technical advisory group on agriculture that's advising on legislation on time. There's a shift in the burden of cost. So if you take agriculture, if the government says, or the regional council says, it's sustainable for you to do your agriculture activity here in this particular area, then the individual agricultural farmer does not have to invest the time and effort to work out whether it's okay to do it there. They just have to say, what type of agriculture am I allowed to do? Great, I'll do that. That's the whole burden of the exploration, the research and so on to prove that site is suitable to the council or the government. And in that, they're working with particular assumptions about what sort of agriculture will be developed and what its effects will be. So we basically freeze agriculture, as we did under the old Harvest Act Marine Farm licensing system before the RMA. We freeze it into a particular type of marine farm. All those old marine farms are basically the same size, and they're all of a particular type, a particular form of marine farming. And the resource manager said, actually, you don't have to be restricted to that if you do look after things. And everyone's like, oh, they started to think for themselves about what they could do. So I do think it's communicating fixed-based planning to the general public is really difficult, whereas activities-based planning is really easy, but it shifts who has to spend the money on whether something is sustainable or safe or not. From the private sector, the person who's going to benefit from doing it, to the public sector, we're going to lose something in the process of the private sector getting that right to do something.
Thank you. Opportunity for one last question.
Just a question about whether you have views on the proposed requirements of spatial planning and the new legislation.
Well, first of all, we've always had spatial planning. The Resource Management Act is spatial planning. So spatial planning based on activities, based on the effects that you see as your thresholds you're going to allow or not. There is some positive in the idea of having some idea of where things are going to be for a long period of time. However, we already have that in the Resource Management Act in the form of designations, and we can have, be renewed over a short period of time. But if it means that with the RMA process, with those designations, the people doing the designation have to keep on revisiting and saying, do we really need this? Are we really going to deliver it or not? In the meantime, that designation sits as a blight on the landowner's land. So if you're going to give them 30 years designation, then whoever's got that is basically their life, as a, the commercial life is of owning that property is with a designation on it, is a bit of a blight on it. I'd much rather we had the shorter assessment with a long-term rollover sort of goal of we'll look at it every 5 years for 10 years out. And that would be a better way of going, with 10 years for 15 years out. And that's really what the spatial planning is doing. It's really based around based around infrastructure. I don't think it's going to deliver us anything dramatic in other spaces that will actually let live for long term.
Hamish, many thanks for taking us through this journey around the Resource Management Act, and particularly sharing your perspective around Te Whare, Lake Elsmere, and surfing. And I'm sure those are two things that are very dear to you, and particularly around coastal management along that way. I'm sure there are more questions that you may have, and we can take an opportunity to have those over some refreshments in the foyer outside. But first of all, please, thank you for your presentation.